Thank you. It is a real pleasure to be back speaking with you after, I think last summer was the last time. And yeah, David is an extraordinary topic. We could spend months on just talking about David's life. There's so much richness to the whole thing. So thank Jimmy for his introduction last week, and I'll try to add a little more to that, but we're still only skimming the surface of the whole. I just want you to know that, because otherwise I'm going to be panting heavily, as I think I can't possibly get through all of this. So, the great King David, because that is what he is. Great. His name in Hebrew, Dawid or Dawid, pretty close to the English, except in ancient Hebrew they would use a W sound rather than a V sound. He is arguably one of the greatest figures of all in ancient Israel, or in the Old Testament. He's certainly arguably the greatest of the kings of Israel, ruling from about 1010 BC to 970 BC. Along with Abraham and with Moses, arguably on the same level as those two, perhaps surpassing Elijah, Josiah, Ezra, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, although we can have debates about each of those. There are three great covenants in the period of the Testament. The covenant with Abraham, the promise to give him innumerable descendants, the land of Canaan, making of him a great nation and a blessing to all other nations. The covenant made with Moses at Mount Sinai, expanded later in the plains of Moab before they engage in the conquest of Canaan, reiterated by Joshua once they make it into the promised land, with a great covenant ceremony that had been commanded by Moses now taking place in Shechem. The law. And we have the covenant with David, a covenant of eternal kingship with his lineage. So important is the covenant of David. During the time of the Davidic monarchy, the rule of David and all his descendants, over 4 centuries, the Davidic covenant during that time actually supplanted the covenant with Moses and Israel on Mount Sinai. So much so that when we get to the time of the reign of the great King Josiah, the only king to rival David, in that time we find that Josiah initiated the celebration of the Passover, which had not been celebrated since the days of the judges. Extraordinary statement. That means all during the time of the monarchy, they did not celebrate the redemption from Egypt in the rite of the Passover. Why? Because supplanting it in significance was the covenant made with David. And what covenant? One of the greatest chapters of all in the Old Testament is 2 Samuel 7, where Yahweh promises to David to give him an eternal house. By house we mean a dynasty, an eternal kingdom and throne, where in the capital city of Jerusalem, on Mount Zion, which now replaces Mount Sinai as the mountain of greatest significance, because that is the place where Yahweh is putting his name. Now, scholars call the house of David's promotion of this great moment in history in 2 Samuel 7, Yahweh's choice of David and Yahweh's choice of Zion, Jerusalem, as the place to put his name. Their promotion of this event as the greatest event in Israel's is called by scholars Judean royal ideology. Judean from Judah, the tribe that David was from in the south. By the way, a little archaeological note on the side, and that is the first inscriptional evidence for the expression the house of David was discovered only in 1993 and 95. Two fragments of a stele, that is an upright commemorative stone, that was found in Dan, north of the Sea of Galilee, and it referred to a king of Syria, or Aram, probably Hazael, not actually mentioned by name, and it tells of his defeat in battle of other kings, including Jehoram, the son of Ahab, the king of Israel. That is of the northern kingdom of Israel, when Israel was a divided nation. And he also defeated Ahaziah, or Ahazyahu, son of Jehoram, who is king of the house of David, Beit Dawid. And you can see the stones on the bottom left, and the bottom of that I highlighted the old archaic Hebrew script in which that is written. You can actually make out the three letters closest to the left. You'll see two what we call dalits, D sounds, for Dawid, in the middle with a, well, I'm not going to go into all of that. But anyway, there you have it. Little archaeological. Isn't that marvelous? Such a late period of time they discover this. Extraordinary. Now, there are lots of great shifts that accompany David's reign. First of all, there is the shift from the tribal confederacy, or the tribal league, a decentralized authority among the 12 tribes of Israel that only get together for emergencies and celebrations, festivals, and so forth. Now we have a monarchy. That is a different style of government than Israel has had to that point. This period of transition in Israel's history is second only to the transition moving from the patriarchal period, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to the period of the Exodus, Sinai, and the conquest of Canaan. After that, the next great moment of transition is this moment of kingship. Now, of course, kingship didn't begin with David. It began with Saul. And Saul was from the northern tribes. That is the tribe of Benjamin. And he had a somewhat tortured reign, a little bit of schizophrenia there, illustrating that he's between, as a transitional period, between the tribal confederacy and the time of the monarchy. But even then, that's a time of great transition, because up until that point, Israel has not a human king, but only one king, namely Yahweh, the God of Israel. That is their sole king. The succession of David after Saul brings new elements into this transition, because David is not from the northern tribes. The northern tribes, especially the tribe of Ephraim, and then secondly the tribe of Manasseh north of it, were the main tribes of Israel up until this point. With the ascendancy of David comes also the ascendancy of the tribe of Judah, from which he's from, the tribe of the south. So we see now a movement from decentralized authority to centralized authority in the king. That raises lots of concerns by the northern tribes. We've also had that as sort of a heritage in the United States, as we move from authority given to the states to more centralized authority with each passing decade given to the federal government. That can be good in some respects, but in other respects it can lead to potential tyranny. It's a transition from egalitarian values. By egalitarian values, we mean everybody is treated as equal before the law. Now, when you have a king, there's somebody a little more equal than everybody else, right? Because of the authority and power being amassed in that office. So we have a movement from the egalitarian values that are treasured in the period of the tribal confederacy to more hierarchical, status-based notions of authority, with the king having the most significant authority because he builds an empire. We have a movement from what we might call charismatic rule, but what I mean by that is rule by judges who only rule during particular emergencies when the Spirit of Yahweh comes upon the judge. Now we're moving to a period of time where rule is going to be hereditary through the Davidic line, not on a case-by-case basis as the Spirit of Yahweh falls on somebody. We have a movement from the dominance, as I said, of the northern tribes now to the dominance of the tribe of Judah. A movement also entailed from the dominance of the associated with the north, the priesthood of the Levites at the central shrine at Shiloh that had once been associated with Eli, to now the dominance of the southern priesthood of the Aaronites, first located in the capital of Judah, Hebron, and then later in Jerusalem in the new capital. So lots of transition taking place. One of the reasons why David is regarded as such a great king is that he becomes an ideal king in bringing together these two great systems. At least until King Josiah, he is the most successful king in wedding together two things: the best of the old northern tribal league, with its singular devotion to Yahweh and its social justice ethos for the poor, for the alien, for the widow, for the orphan, caring for them, very important, as an understanding of who they are. But at the same time, David wedding that set of values with the best of the institution of monarchy: military conquest, stability in the land, international prestige. He is uniting both the tribal ideal with monarchical power and pragmatism. That had to happen during David's time, because Israel, when David came around, Israel was on the verge of being destroyed by the Philistines. It was the greatest threat to that period of time to Israel's survival. It would not be exceeded until the time of the great empires of Assyria and Babylon threatened Israel. And it's David who met that great threat. Because of David's significance, the author from Joshua to 2 Kings, whom scholars label, I'm sorry, this is a multi-syllable word here, Deuteronomistic historian, and it's, I know, that's a mouthful. Go home and just say to somebody, Deuteronomistic historian. You'll amaze your friends and family. Actually, it hasn't worked for me, but it'll work for you. And that's because the material from Joshua through 2 Kings evaluates the kings and the leaders based on the template given in the book of Deuteronomy. So we call the figure who we otherwise don't know, but a best guess would be either Jeremiah or Baruch, because there are lots of similarities in themes and phrases between Jeremiah and his scribe Baruch and the material in the Deuteronomistic history, but that's just a guess. He evaluated all the Davidic kings that followed David after the standard of David. How well did they stack up to the model or example that David put forward? That historian spoke of Yahweh's special protection of Judah which would be greater than the protection offered to the northern kingdoms, the northern tribes rather, of Israel. Remember, Israel after Solomon is a split or divided kingdom. The tribe of Judah in the south and all the other tribes in the north under the rubric Israel. There'd be a special protection of Judah because of Yahweh's unconditional oath to David and his lineage, and because of a sort of reservoir of grace that David had built up as a man that God called after his own heart. And here we have some of these elements, a constant refrain: for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen, Yahweh will do such and such. Now, in 5 instances where the king is actually righteous, the historian says he did right in the eyes of Yahweh, like his father David. In the description of Judah's kings that are evil, there's a double refrain. He committed all the sins his father did before him. His heart was not true to Yahweh, like the heart of his father David, ancestor David. Nevertheless, for David's sake, Yahweh is God, gave that king a lamp or a holding in Jerusalem, because David did what was right in the sight of Yahweh. You may not be doing what is right as king in the sight of Yahweh, but your ancestor David did, and because of that, I'm not going to completely destroy you. That sort of reservoir of grace built up by David for all that followed. And David did not turn aside from anything that Yahweh commanded him all the days of his life, except, big except, in the matter of Uriah the Hittite, the Bathsheba episode. Only of all the kings, only Josiah escapes all criticism by the Deuteronomistic historian. Josiah did right, and he walked in all the way of David his father. And like him, there was no king before him who turned to Yahweh with all his heart, soul, and might. Echoing what we call from Deuteronomy the Shema, Hear, O Israel, right? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Josiah embodied that and was therefore a wonderful complement to David. Now, expectations built up about a returning Davidite. What I mean by Davidite is descendant of David who would rule. When Israel came back from exile in Babylon in successive returns, attempts were made to restore the Davidic monarchy with 2 heirs of David. One, Sheshbazzar, that's another name you can say at home, and Zerubbabel. Okay, 2 great names. If I had had sons, that would have been their names. How about that? Okay? Both of them were Davidites, and Zerubbabel, both of them function as sort of governors for the returning exiles in Judah, but it never worked out that they could become king. We don't even actually know how their lives ended. And as a result of these unsuccessful attempts, there remained an expectation still that there would be a Davidic anointed one. Because, right, remember what Samuel did when he called David to be king? He anointed him. He poured from a ram's horn, hollowed out with oil in it. He poured that oil on David's head as a way of illustrating God's special selection of him for office. And so they became this expectation of this returning Davidite who would be the anointed one, which is simply the Hebrew word for Messiah, or in Greek, Christ. It simply means the anointed one. And an expectation, according to Micah 5:2, that he would even be born, this ideal Davidite coming in the future, from the same hometown of Bethlehem as David had been born in. So we see later this being applied, Christians applied this expectation, of course, to Jesus. That's right, Jesus. I knew you knew it. You're just pulling my cord here. Okay. Remember the angel declared to Gabriel, right? You'll give birth to a son, call his name Jesus. He'll be called Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give to him what? The throne of David, his father. And he will reign as king over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end. Only Jesus ultimately will fulfill that role, especially at his return. Matthew's genealogy in Matthew 1 presents Jesus as not only being in the line of David, but also coming at the exact right time. 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 generations from David to the Babylonian exile, a great watershed moment in history, 14 generations from the exile to the Christ. And in fact, all Hebrew letters correspond to numbers, and if you add up the numbers corresponding to the letters for the name David, with D having a 4 value and the W or V having a 6 value, it comes out to 14. Paul declares Jesus to be from the seed of David twice. In the book of Revelation, Jesus, the Lion of Judah, is called the root of David. And he has the key of David to open or shut the door to the kingdom that he will now rule. You see the significance of David? Wow, this is an important guy, right? And he occupies a very large part of the canon, as was noted. Second half of 1 Samuel, the whole of 2 Samuel, and first 2 chapters of 1 Kings. Scholars identify here there are 2 important old narrative sources for David's life used by the Deuteronomistic historian. One is the history of David's rise from 1 Samuel 16 to 2 Samuel 5. And the whole purpose of this work is to legitimate David's rise to power. It's Yahweh's doing to anoint David as king and as Saul's replacement. There's a lot of resentment in the northern tribes that their guy, Saul, replaced by this upstart southerner. So that has to be explained, and that's what this work does. And it vindicates David from several charges of wrongdoing circulating at this time. His rebellion against Saul, his service of the Philistines, allegedly, as he was escaping from Saul. Where else is he going to go? Philistine territory is the only other place. Right, so that's got to be explained. This is disastrous. So it's got to be explained. David, history of the rise of David shows, was loyal to Saul completely throughout his life. And it's only Saul, racked by madness, trying to kill David, and forced David into rebellion. David, however, was in covenant relationship with Saul's son, Jonathan. Remember, covenant is kinship. Covenant is the extension of kinship privileges and obligations across bloodlines. Okay? So David making a covenant with Jonathan, Jonathan is saying, I'm now regarding you as my older brother, and now thus the heir to the throne of my father Saul. Philistine army and its outlaws' ways can be explained. He's just getting away from Saul, but he's not actually serving the Philistines. He's actually raiding Philistine territories, but not letting the Philistines know it, etc. And it's also not about David's bravery, his success as a warrior against the Philistines. Okay? Probably that document was written during the time of David himself. And it was directed as an apology to conservative elements in the northern tribes to say David is the rightful king selected by Yahweh. And then there is the succession narrative, or the court history of David, running from 2 Samuel 9 through 20, and then picking up again in 1 Kings 1 to 2. This tells of the decline of David. It highlights the Bathsheba episode in chapters 11 to 12, and then leads from that into a discussion of the struggle for succession of David, the revolt of David's own son Absalom in chapters 13 of 2 Samuel. The revolt of a northerner from Benjamin named Sheva in 2 Samuel 20. And then all the conspiring going on between the supporters of David's son Adoniah and the supporters of David's other son Solomon as to who will replace the aging David who is near death, described in 2 Kings 1 and 2. Probably this work dates from Solomon's reign. And many historians see it as the first pure example of history writing in all of the ancient Near East, because it speaks openly and critically of the ruler and his favors. That is unheard of among the College of Kings in the ancient Near East. You never see a document like this produced, but it's the graphic honesty of Scripture, showing both the strengths and the weaknesses. David, of course, is also known as a musician and has a connection with the book of Psalms. He's known for playing the lyre, for singing his musical compositions. He's hired by Saul early on to be in his service, to soothe his soul, Saul's soul, with the music, because Saul's soul is tormented by an evil spirit sent from Yahweh. We have a very old, archaic song embedded in 2 Samuel 1, which David laments the deaths of Saul and Jonathan. There's this cataclysmic battle with the Philistines in which Saul and Jonathan are killed. And David is completely heartbroken. I'm distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was more wonderful than the love of a woman. As a brother to me, we gave our lives for each other. The archaic last words of David in 2 Samuel 23 begin with the words, the oracle of David, singer of the tales of Israel. The very earliest writing prophet that we have, the book of Amos, chapter 6, verse 5, refers to those who, like David, composed tunes for themselves on musical instruments. There are many psalms attributed to David in the book of Psalms. At the very end of book 2, there are 5 basic books in the Psalms. The Psalms are built over a period of centuries, basically a collection of 5 books. At the end of the second book, we have the prayers of David, son of Jesse, are ended. Although then we see other Psalms of David appear in books 3 to 5, indicating other Psalms of David were discovered after this period of time and added to the collection. Almost all of the Psalms in books 1 to 2 are prefaced with the words, to or of David. A psalm to or of David. Occasionally, as I noted, attributions to David are made afterwards. See a whole listing there. In total, we have 73 psalms in the Psalter attributed to David. And if you count 2 other psalms that are attributed to David in the New Testament, but not specifically so in the Psalms, that would bring it to a nice even 75. Half the Psalter attributed to David. Now, although tradition attributes the entire book of the Psalms to David, of course, David is more of a rubric over the whole book. He's not the author of each psalm. We know that because there are psalms attributed to other persons. Some are anonymous, and some are attributed to Asaph, some to the sons of Korah, and still others beyond that. Moreover, the authorship of individual psalm scholars think is generally unknown, even those that appear to be attributed to David. The heading, or what we call colophon, over those psalms, scholars believe was attached secondarily, didn't originally come with those. So they may or may not, in any given individual case, be attributed to David, although, of course, I think they generally are authentically David's. Whenever one reads in the English Psalm of David, the Hebrew actually says Psalm to David, using a preposition la, which normally means to. Possibly the meaning here is the Psalms belonging to David, in the sense of being funded by the patronage of the house of David. So all this raises some question of the exact extent, although David is clearly the nucleus of the Psalms there. Now, I want to talk about how David was such an effective king. The most important thing that David had to do was bring together the divided parts of Israel. That meant the northern tribes that he was not from and had once been the dominant force in the whole landscape of Israel, and the southern tribe of Judah, which is the upstart tribe, his own tribe. So the northern tribes are worried. They're worried that we're going to lose that singular devotion to Yahweh. We're going to lose the values for the oppressed and the poor and the outcast in Israel with this absolute despot taking control, this king. And David wants to show them, no, I respect the old values. I'm not going to give them up. So he does 5 main things to show that he's going to unify the nation. He moves his capital. Up until this point, his capital had been south in Judah. Now he moves it to a neutral city, Jerusalem, which until David's conquest of it was the last Canaanite city in Canaan not to be taken over. So it's somewhat of a neutral city, and it's close. It's in the south, but very close to the border with the northern kingdom. So it's like in the United States when we moved the capital from New York City to Washington, D.C., which was actually a bargain that Alexander Hamilton made with Thomas Jefferson. That was regarded as the South at the time. Different direction from here, but same principle involved. And when he moved the capital to Jerusalem, he transferred the major tribal league cult symbol, that of the Ark of the Covenant, on the cherubim of which Yahweh was thought to be enthroned, with his feet on the box of the Ark, resting like a footstool. And he brought that Ark to Jerusalem with great pageantry. To do what? To show his zeal for Yahweh. His singular devotion to Yahweh that had characterized the old tribal league. When he brought the ark in, as you know, he did what we see happen all the time here on Sundays. He got in the aisles and he danced. I got to admit, I don't have the courage for that yet. Maybe one day I'm going to break out with the dance, okay? Just get ready, but don't mock me, just, because what happened here might happen to you. He danced and he leapt before Yahweh with all his might, with an exposed backside, by the way, wearing only the priestly linen ephod or apron. Okay, did you get that, Carol? I just want to make sure. Okay, I don't want to hear this at home later. You exposed your backside, Rob. Okay. Now, Michal, Saul's daughter, and one of David's wives, the text says, despised him because he dishonored himself. This is not the way a king should behave. In covering himself like any vulgar fellow. And David responded that this self-humiliation, self-abasement on his part was appropriate to the occasion because Yahweh had chosen him over Michal's father, Saul. And because of her reaction, Michal had no child to the day of her death, made barren by Yahweh as judgment for her judgment of David, dancing and leaping in connection with the Ark of the Covenant. You see how David is a man after God's own heart? A nice little illustration. David dancing on the left there. Doesn't show the exposed backside, but hey, this is for public consumption. Secondly, David agrees in response to a declaration that Yahweh makes to him through the prophet Nathan. He's not going to construct a grand temple for Yahweh, but he's going to keep the Ark of the Covenant in the movable tent shrine that they had had since the wilderness or desert sojourn when they left. David had intimated to Nathan the prophet that Yahweh needed a temple that'd be commensurate with David's new cedar palace. Yahweh can't be in a little tent. I got a big palace. Got to give something big temple for Yahweh. Initially, Nathan gave the okay. But that same night the word of Yahweh came to Nathan, go and tell my servant David, thus says Yahweh, I have not lived in a house that is a permanent, stationary, grandiose temple since the day that I brought the people of Israel out of Egypt to this day. But I have been moving about. That's my notice to shut up. But I did it 5 minutes before I had to shut up. Okay. This means I have to basically cut my losses as I move on here. Yahweh all throughout has been moving around in a tent or tabernacle. So David agrees not to build a temple for Yahweh. It's a concession as a king. Because in the ancient Near East, kings gained their legitimacy, their respect among all other kings by building a magnificent temple to their patron god. It would be all about the king. But David says, I can live without a temple if that's what's needed in order to pacify the northerners who are nostalgic for the time of the tribal league. There's an important symbolism here. The tent of meeting symbolizes a fidelity to the values of the old tribal confederacy. It symbolizes God as a God who moves and is not merely stationary. You can't manipulate simply because you're the king. It's a symbol of God's resistance to every human manipulation, especially by the king. Thirdly, David appoints not one, but 2 high priests at the same time. One from the north, Abiathar, whom David had known when he was on the run from Saul, and the other from his own south in Judah, Zadok. So he brought together 2 priesthoods, one claiming to be descended from Aaron, the one in the south, and the other claiming to be descended from Moses, the priesthood of Levites. Solomon would end up getting rid of the northern priesthood, Abiathar. Fourthly, David accepted the watchful eye of the prophet, especially the prophet Nathan, also the prophet Gad. That's very important. You have nothing like this in the rest of the ancient Near East. Oh yes, you have prophets, you have court prophets, but these court prophets tell the king whatever the king wants to hear. And if they didn't, they'd be executed immediately. David was different. He understood that Yahweh had constructed not where he had the sole rule, but actually had divided the power between the king and his prophets. And his prophets had the power of king-making and king-breaking. And they had the power to enforce the old covenant league law given at Sinai and thereafter. And the king had to obey the word of Yahweh coming from the prophet. Imagine if we had a prophet that could actually go to Joe Biden and say, Joe, you're really messed up here. You're going to do the following from now on. And Biden actually obeyed. I'd pass out with a heart attack. I don't know about you. And Nathan will factor in 2 significant stories. One, the big one, 2 Samuel 7, Yahweh says, you don't build me a house, namely a temple, I build you a house, a dynasty. And that's what David does. He gives to David this eternal house. But after that, 5 chapters later in 2 Samuel, we have Nathan coming back, criticizing him for taking Uriah the Hittite's wife, Bathsheba, as his own. Nothing like this in the ancient Near East. Right? David can have any woman in Israel that he wants. He already had a harem of wives. And Yahweh tells him later, if that had been not enough, I'd have given you more. Don't get this as an advice or example to follow, gentlemen. I don't think this is what you should follow here. Don't forget, Jesus is teaching later. But he sees Bathsheba and he wants her. And he gets her. Why? Because he's the king. You see now he's acting like an ancient Near Eastern despot. He's grabbing what he wants. And that's what this symbolizes. So Nathan comes to him and tells him a parable. Only David doesn't realize it's a parable. He thinks it's a true story, right? You got a poor man who has a favorite lamb, treated like a member of the household, sort of like our dog Benji until Karis was born, and then Benji we realized was a dog. That was a tough day for Benji. Actually, that wasn't Benji. That was a previous dog, Coco. But Benji had his episode with Eliana. And then you had a rich man who had huge flocks. And a traveler, came and visited the rich man. And you know what he decided? Instead of sacrificing one of his own lambs, he took that one favorite lamb of the poor man. Now, when David heard that, he was outraged. That man should be punished severely. Now, David could see the wrong in another. I can see it'd be wrong to take and slay another man's lamb, but to take another man's wife and then to put that man in the front lines to have him killed, to have my misdeed covered up? Oh, I don't know how I missed that. And you have that great iconic line by Nathan, "You are that man." And any other king in the ancient Near East, that prophet would have been killed on the spot. That's my last and final warning. He would have been killed on the spot. But David instead repents. Consequences are not over. As a result of this, you laid with a man's wife. Now your neighbor will lay with your wives in the open, in public, and it will turn out to be your son, Absalom. He will take your harem over as a mark that he's now king, and you will be humiliated across the whole land. But there's also a note of grace. Bathsheba was pregnant with child. That child would die, that's true. But he would raise up another child, Bathsheba, namely Solomon, Shlomo in Hebrew. Be the great King Solomon. So still a note of grace. Okay, I have to skip over Gad, I'm cutting my losses here. Fifth and finally, no particular order here, but David proves himself to be the great military protector that the North He built an empire from the river of Egypt in the south to the Euphrates River in the north. He defeated the Philistines, subdued them, and ended the great threat to Israel. A couple of quick lines here. When David is anointed as king, remember, he doesn't select all the older sons of Jesse. He selects David. Yahweh says, anoint him. This is the one. And when he selected David, he followed a principle. Do not look on his appearance or on his height. Yahweh does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance. Which shows not only David's individual bravery, by the way, there's a nice little line about this in the greatest sports movie of all time. Who's yours? I don't want to have any debate on this point. But it also shows how Yahweh achieves victory through the small and the weak who put their trust in him, so that God gets the ultimate credit. David repeatedly attributes his victory over Goliath to Yahweh, not to himself. And it illustrates Israel's small place on the world stage. Yahweh lifts up this small nation, and it'll also later illustrate God's accomplishing of salvation through the weakness and foolishness of the cross. Well, I'm going to have to skip over all the other stuff. This was great material, but let's move past it here. I covered basically more or less. Let's go to some takeaways about David's life. Could I have some awe? Could I have a few awes there? Thank you. I appreciated that. That's good for my heart. David's story presents us a rags to riches story, right? David, unlike his son Solomon, who grew up in the court, David came from humble beginnings. And he rose from that through Yahweh's work to the highest station over everything. God showing that he can choose the unlikely to magnify his power. David stayed a humble man, showing respect to the anointed King Saul, even when Saul had been rejected by Yahweh and Saul was persecuting David. As we just noted, David accepted the critique of Yahweh's prophets, even though he was the great king. David, as we noted, is deeply devoted to Yahweh as his God. He's called a man after God's own heart. And he shows repeatedly in the Psalms why God's special covenant with him is justified. He is a man of God's heart. He does pour out his heart constantly to Yahweh and looking to Yahweh, trusting in him. David early on showed himself to be a man of courage. He was the Goliath episode. He wasn't afraid to trust in Yahweh for military victory, even though the odds were stacked against him. He repeatedly risked his life to rescue God's people. David was a unifier. He tried to hold together the two halves of Israel, the south and the north. He did so by balancing the old revered values of the past with the need for change due to the crisis with the Philistine threat. And he finally provided a model for a future ideal Davidite, one who would come and establish the kingdom of God eternally on earth, one who could perfect what not even David could perfect, both giving justice to the powerless and also protecting the nation against evil powers. We recognize that fulfillment of that hope to be Jesus. If you've had a difficult experience, if you're expecting a difficult experience, if you're giving up on Yahweh and what Yahweh does for us, think of David. Think of what David had to go through. Think about how God was able to work mightily in this one against all the odds because his heart was given over to Yahweh. Never despair that God cannot take what appears to be something small and weak in the world's eye, something impossible to accomplish, and yet accomplish it and make that small or weak person great in the eyes of Yahweh. Because that's where it counts. It doesn't matter what other people say or think. It ultimately doesn't even matter what achievements we accrue in this world. What matters is that we be a person after God's own heart, where God's interests are most important in our life. Can I get a final amen to that, everyone? Amen. God's blessings on His word proclaimed to you today.